This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here are your hosts, Jeff Deist and Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Human Action Podcast. I am one of your standard hosts, Bob Murphy. Jeff can't be with us this week, but he will be back next week. We do have, though, for your listening pleasure, Peter St. Onge with us. Peter, how's it going?
It is going great, Bob. Thanks.
So I wanted to have you on because you've been just tweeting up a storm, parlaying some of your YouTube videos on all the banking stuff. So we have a few topics I want to hit, but one in particular that struck me that was interesting that I haven't seen other people reporting on it, but I saw it from you, was the fact that the head of Silicon Valley Bank was not just a regular banker. He was also tied in with the Fed. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's pretty astounding. So he was one of the 9 directors of the San Francisco Fed, which is the regional Fed that in theory is regulating and monitoring, supervising Silicon Valley Bank. And of course, when Silicon Valley Bank failed, the first response of the regulators was to scapegoat and try to figure out, who did what. And the irony there is that the malfeasant here, the person who caused this, the CEO of the bank itself, is actually one of them. So, sort of the, I can't believe there's gambling going on here.
Let me read a little bit, because this is nothing new, in case people are astounded that this happened. So one of the things, back when the Bernie Madoff, Ponzi scheme was unveiled, and that was a big deal for a while, I did some research into that. And so one element of that story that I didn't hear a lot of people picking up was that Madoff himself was connected to the SEC. And in fact, there were private watchdog groups that were for years, in some cases, sending, warnings to the SEC, the various regulatory bodies, saying, hey, I've been looking at this Madoff enterprise, and these numbers just don't make any sense. This has to be I don't know if they said it has to be a Ponzi scheme, but they were saying these numbers don't make any sense. This can't be right. You need to look into this. And the warnings were ignored for years. So here, I'm reading just from a Fortune article on this, and after the Bernie Madoff thing broke, and it says, for years, Madoff was a bright star in the SEC's constellation, a legendary investment manager with celebrity clients, as well as multitudes of ordinary investors. He was chairman of the NASDAQ stock market in 1990, 91, and 93, and he sat on SEC advisory committees. Now, in this Fortune article, they don't say this, but I vaguely recall at the time that it wasn't merely that Madoff was on various committees generically, but specifically, at least one of them had to do with like ethical conduct on, in financial markets. Like, so that it was really a case of the fox guarding the henhouse. Let's see. Then Congress brought him in. That was the question posed in Washington after Madoff was arrested and confessed. Blah, blah, blah. Top SEC officials were hauled before Congress. The agency's enforcement and inspection staff had received credible complaints about Madoff, including specific red flags on his operations from financial analyst whistleblower Harry Markopoulos and his investigators, which were conveyed to SEC staff in Boston, New York, and Washington, and so forth. Okay, so again, it's when it comes to people talk about who don't know much. Oh, we need to have stricter regulation, and Elizabeth Warren has been going off about what SVP did, and my joke was, is she going to enforce 100% reserve banking? Like, what specifically are they going to do, in light of this? But with the Madoff thing, yeah, it was literally the private sector was on to him first and was warning the government regulators, and they ignored it, partly because Madoff himself was sitting on some of those boards.
Right. And if you are a professional cat burglar, you would very much like to be on the government regulator of burglary, of who gets to enter houses. Right. So it is a very attractive target for any scammer. I mean, really, if you're good at your job, the first thing you're going to do is try to infiltrate those kinds of ethics boards and any kind of oversight committee. The profits are enormous, right? Because the other scammer competition is shut out, and you've got this privileged access. So I think it should concern people. And there's kind of a wider question. Our government places administrative independence on a pedestal, right? Independent central banking, independent regulators, ethics, and so on. And one might ask the question, if that independence means that these regulators and these functions are isolated from the rest of the government, and by the way, isolated from the people who allegedly run the country, are you sort of creating this closed box where you've got these contacts in circulation, kind of a revolving door and golden parachutes in their little world, so that it becomes a sort of crony universe that we the people have no influence over?
Yeah, and I'm glad you used that phrase, the revolving door. I'm sure people have heard that. And in case people have heard it and they actually never had someone spell it, the idea is that people in industry, they serve there, they get time in industry, then they go, when they retire, they go put into public service, and they go in the various regulatory bodies that oversee the industries they used to be a part of. And the concern is whether it's like completely, cynical and they do it knowing full what's going on, or whether it's merely just, hey, those people, they're your buddies, and you remember what it was like to be running a bank, or or to run a car company, and geez, that's really a tough job, and now that I'm in the regulatory seat, let me try to look out for those guys. And so, but the idea being that you're going to be beholden to them and do favors, and then also too, the way it works in practice, it's not as naked as somebody funneling money to a Swiss bank account or something to the person while they're sitting on the CFTC or whatever. It's just that they know, if I play ball, if I'm a team player, whatnot, then when I step down from that role, I might get a cushy consulting position, as the elder statesman. And, I've been in the industry for 30 years and in and out of government service. And now I have this cushy job where I write a blog post once a week and get paid $200,000 a year, that sort of thing. So right. It's a very, old boys network kind of arrangement. But also, it's when people say, oh, well, we need to fix it, it would be tricky, given that the federal government is going to come in and regulate these industries or these financial sectors or whatnot. The solution is not to say, okay, well, then no one with any industry experience can have any input in what we do.
Exactly.
Because then it's complete chaos. To give an example, it was, so in case people don't know, there's these things when the government announces some new rule, proposed rulemaking or whatever their jargon is, then there's a comment period, industry and whatever, and lobby groups weigh in on it. And that, again, that's not merely just groups vying for their share of the pie. In some cases, it really is the case that the proposed regulations are crazy. Like they literally contradict some other regulation, and somebody has to come forward and say, you guys can't do that. So an example would be with the ethanol regulations that were put in place under the George W. Bush, that free market, laissez-faire, radical anarchist George W. Bush. One of the things that his administration put through were ethanol requirement that, you had to blend in more ethanol into the fuel mix. And the way the regulation was, it wasn't a percentage. It was just, there was a staircase of absolute amounts. And so then when the Great Recession hit and driving, well, it wasn't drives, but fuel consumption went down, I think, because of, trucking and stuff. All of a sudden, the percentage of ethanol in the fuel mix was going to be so high, it was going to violate some other rule about, that was going to mess up people's engines. And so, and so they were getting exemptions. Like every year they had to, do another exemption or something because the regulation as stated would have been insane. But so the problem, it's top down. There's no right way for the government to kind of run an economy.
No, you're absolutely right. And once you give government control of a function, like once you are giving government the ability to completely determine all of the rules and all of the capital flows in our financial system, the only way to do that and not break it is to bring in insiders. And then the question is, well, once you bring insiders, does that inevitably lead to the fox guarding the henhouse, so regulatory capture? And, if we look in finance, yes, it appears to. A second issue, Bob, is something that you mentioned, is the the regulations contradicting each other. And this is a bit like if you go to the doctor and if you are taking 100 different prescription medicines, you better have a good doctor, because that doctor has to figure out which ones contradict, which ones interact, which ones are going to kill you. And we have an economy today that has so many, literally nobody knows how many regulations there are, right? Every year you've got these various attempts by Mercatus and different outfits that try to tally up the regulations. Literally they go by page count because nobody has the vaguest concept how many regulations, how many laws companies have to have to be following. So it's not even 100 medicines that you're on. These are tens of thousands of medicines. So not only do you need that expertise, in fact, to the point where you're dealing with such a small number of people that, yes, there's a good chance you're going to have regulatory capture. They're all going to know each other. They're going to have worked for each other. They're going to work for each other in future. But in addition to that, you have no idea what kind of deadly outcomes are going to come from those interactions. So, I mean, it's to the point where even if you bring in a bunch of PhDs who try to determine what are the unintended consequences, what are the perverse incentives, if you're talking millions of pages of rules, that we don't have humans that good yet, we won't for a while yet.
Right, and another famous example of that was when Hank Paulson was, in government when the financial crisis hit, and then the fateful decision to let Lehman go down. A lot of people were saying, well, gee, I wonder if that's because, he had been a rival of them, when he was in the private sector. And, who knows? But it's hard. Again, even if it's not purely cynical, it's hard for people. That's why, judges have to recuse themselves. If their daughter's on, the guy's daughter's on trial or something, he can't be the judge in that case. Things like
exactly.
that. So I suppose, why don't we just instead of just moving on and we just complained about a bunch of stuff, what would, and I know we have other things we want to get into, but just to not leave people hanging there. So are we just whining and belly aching, or, how could there be quote regulation of the financial sector if we don't have an SEC running it or a CFTC and so forth?
Oh, my ideal, I think yours as well, would just be to get rid of all of the regulations and go to a liability-based system. This is largely what we had in the Lochner era before the progressives destroyed our economy. And so the idea was you can pretty much do what you want because economic rights are fundamental human rights. And if you hurt somebody, right, if you are negligent or, if you cause some harm to somebody else, then of course they can take you to court. It was much easier to do that because the Lawyers Guild had not yet captured the legal system. And so that meant that, potential evildoers, companies who are making unsafe products or whatever, they would be forced to include the damage to consumers. Okay, they would be forced to include that in the price of the item, and so this is economically extremely efficient. But another side benefit, of course, is that you just get rid of the entire regulatory state. You go back to a liability basis, based on common law, based on very, very simple, easy to understand rules that make sense to to the general public and that are understandable for companies, so they can actually guess what's right and what's wrong based on common sense, not based on having to hire lawyers for $1 million to read through thousands of regulations.
Yeah, definitely. And two, I think people need to remember that the choice isn't regulation or not. It's regulation from the top down and from political institutions where if something goes wrong, they get more funding, right? So the SEC completely fumbled the ball on Bernie Madoff. It's not that they had their budget cut in half and they had to have massive layoffs. Everyone, we need to beef up the SEC. Clearly, they're understaffed, right? Or if a plane crashes, not because of some freak event, but because the inspectors from the FAA were caught smoking dope behind the shed or something instead of doing what they're supposed to do. It's not that the SEC or the FAA loses funding; it actually gets more funding, right? Because clearly it's an antiquated system. We've been starving them for fun. So it's not surprising that those oversight bodies don't work very well when the incentives are that messed up. It's almost like you're just relying on the basic decency of humans to do the right thing, even though the incentives are the opposite. And then where in the world do you want to not rely on human decency? It's at the level of the federal government and bureaucracies up there. But you can have, private watchdog groups. Again, that Harry Markowitz, he was the one who was flagging Madoff's thing. He wasn't just doing that as a hobby. That was his business. He was an analyst who gave reports to subscribers and things, and he was just warning his people on his, I don't know if it was a newsletter or how he did it, saying, hey, I'd steer clear of this Madoff guy. And then he just, as a good citizen, passed some of that stuff up, up the chain. So yes, or consumer reports thing. You want to go buy a new car. There's plenty of private groups that evaluate them. You can get all sorts of information, especially now with the internet. So it's easy. And again, I would just caution people to not just assume, have all that stuff, but really to really make sure the job gets done, you got to have Washington D.C. in charge of it. What more would they have to do to show that that's not a good strategy?
Well, you're absolutely right. If you look at FTX and really across crypto, people in crypto, there's a lot of them who are extraordinarily smart. B, they are very, very vigilant, very, passionate, enthusiastic. People knew FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried, was shady years ago. There's concerns about Tether or Binance, like any company that could be shady. There's an entire industry of people who go and look after these. CoffeeZilla, for example, is one on YouTube. He's great. He kind of goes through, he says, does this look like a scam? Does this not? There is an entire free market industry that is dedicated to detecting fraud. The government, if we take the case of FTX, he was literally meeting with, he met with Gensler, he met with the White House over and over. He was hanging out, he was having face-to-face meetings with the heads of these agencies. You don't just get that after you're nobody, okay? Somebody's got to call somebody to get you that face-to-face meeting with him. So the idea that we, the people, knew, right? We, the industry, we were trying to warn about all these scams. We were warning users, don't put your money into this guy, he's a scammer. And the regulators were sitting there whining and dining with this guy. So it should raise suspicion whether the regulators are cleaning it up or are they the ones making it dirty?
Yeah, definitely. Okay, why don't we transition? Another thing that you did recently that I was very interested in was you were talking about the Bank of Japan and some of their impending losses or warnings they're putting out. And so maybe just quickly tell the people what's the news hook, and then we'll talk more broadly about these fascinating topics.
Yeah, so yesterday, Bank of Japan warned that if rates on the 10-year bond go to 2%, then they're going to have a loss on their books of about $400 billion. And, the Japanese economy is much smaller, so if we take that in U.S. terms, it'd be something like $1.8 trillion of losses on their books. And the rates up there have been trying very hard to get to 2%. In other words, bonds have been falling, and then the Central Bank of Japan has been moving heaven and earth to try to buy these up in order to stop that. And so, that then raises the question, okay, what exactly happens to a country if their central bank is losing money? And that's topical here because our own beloved Federal Reserve is now losing about $2 billion per week, and those losses are just accumulating for them now.
Now, that particular figure, is that the mark-to-market loss and reduction in the asset value, or is that the mismatch in how much they're paying? Like, is that a cash flow loss? Do you know?
A cash flow. So let's see. They've got it booked at a certain amount. Yeah, this is just from the roll off. So okay. they have not gone back and that I know of and marked to market their entire portfolio. If they did, I suspect to be a very, very large number.
Okay, yeah,
and also you would expect that to happen all at once. So.
Yeah, because we covered right, and interest rates aren't rising every week, so that it must be that number. Right. Yeah, because the distinction for the listener, and Jeff and I did cover this back. Mercatus came out with a study talking about the Fed's losses, and so there's the two-pronged distinction of just their assets get marked down, so if they had to realize it, that would be a loss. But then even you can say, oh yeah, but they're going to hold to maturity, so who cares? But actual cash flow, they're in trouble because they're paying interest, on reserves to the banks, and so that's money going out their door. And so then if they're getting less in, then because of that. So anyway, that was so. Why should the average American citizen care?
Right. So in a sense. So in a sense, the losses themselves don't matter that much, right? The Fed has a giant money printer in the basement. They can make anything. It's not like they're going to have to shut down and lay off Jerome Powell, however tempting that may be. The main real-world impact is just that the Fed maintains this balance sheet, and they've got a bunch of assets and a bunch of liabilities. The liabilities are primarily dollar and its various counterfeit versions. And if that goes negative, in other words, if they're technically bankrupt, then at that point they stop handing profits over to Congress. And those profits are actually pretty large. They're about $100 billion a year before COVID, which is about half of what the corporate income tax takes. So that's the main real-world impact, is simply that, the sort of free money shuts off for governments, and then they have to find some way to replace that. And, the way we're going at the moment, it could be many decades before that money flow goes back to Treasury. But before people say, okay, let's just let it rip. Of course, when we look at the Fed's balance sheet and we look at all their liabilities, in a sense, those are the scalps, or like the deer on the wall, mounted on the wall, for all of the resources that they have counterfeited over the years and that they have seized from the rest of us. So that's not to say necessarily that that it's a good thing when the Fed is running around printing up new money, but it is to say that the harm came from printing the money. The harm is not necessarily whether technically they have greater liabilities than assets.
Okay, why don't we take a minute, because you made a bunch of good points there, but again, I know some listeners, they probably hear these things, but no one's ever fully explained it. So just the piece you sort of offhand remarked that, and the Fed, I guess the verb they use is remitted, like they remit their profits to the Treasury.
Yeah.
Some people might be surprised to hear, like, well, no, I thought the Fed was this independent thing sitting over here, and its job was to, maintain high employment and low price inflation, and that's its dual mandate. What do you mean the Fed's giving money to Congress? How does that work?
Yeah, this was kind of the deal ever since the beginning of modern central banking with the Bank of England. Really, in France, John Law's scam had worked the same way. But generally, the idea is that every central bank in the world, they print up money, and then they can lend that money out at interest, and so they make profits every year, right? If you're a counterfeiter and you're lending out your counterfeit money, it would be really shocking if you didn't make profits. You'd be a pretty bad lender at that point. And they hand that money over to government. And so in a sense, you can look at it as the government licenses central banks to be counterfeiters, and in exchange, the central banks give them chunks of money. And in the U.S. case, that comes out to about $100 billion a year. But the same pattern is really duplicated all over the world. The Bank of England is really kind of, I think the modern template. And then the Fed ultimately was based on that.
Yeah, and so for listeners, if you get my book on money mechanics from the Mises Institute, it's free. You get the PDF if you want. We'll put a link in the show notes page for this episode. I go through the specifics with the Federal Reserve. So it's this weird, people talk, I'm sure you hear this too, Peter, when people are like, the Fed's privately owned. And it's like, yes and no. So yes, the member, they are like shareholders. The Federal Reserve does have shareholders that are private entities. So it's not like the Food and Drug Administration. It is kind of a weird thing. And they do get guaranteed, so they had to put in capital, to get into the system to become a shareholder. And then they do get, the Fed, like you say, in a normal year would have a bunch of profit because it's, again, they got a printing press. They buy bonds, they earn interest. The Fed has expenses, it's got all the staff economists and stuff cranking out papers saying how great the Fed is. They got the, lighting, they got to pay someone to cut the lawn or whatever. But typically they have a bunch of profit. They do distribute dividends to their, their shareholders. But it's a fixed number of what they give. And then, they got a pile usually left over, and they remit that to the Treasury. And like you say, presumably that's sort of a quid pro quo that the federal government is saying, all right, we're going to give you this privileged position, but in exchange, after you pay yourself a handsome little guaranteed return, you give us the balance. And, so that's a nice little scratch my back, I'll scratch your kind of relationship. And so what you're saying, Peter, is, among other possible ramifications, one implication of the fact that the Fed is not just suffering a reduction on its asset side, but also, like we said, is even cash flow negative, I believe, because, again, they're paying more in interest to bankers than they're getting in, that they don't have excess earnings right now to be remitting to the Treasury. And in fact, they're like reporting it's this weird accounting thing where they have a negative liability to the Treasury. And so it's going to take time to whittle that down.
Which is an asset for them.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So that's an asset, believe it or not. That's very cute.
So, So among other things that up till now, I guess from the taxpayer's perspective, sure, the Fed was printing a bunch of money and making, dollars have a diluted purchasing power unless I happen to be a defense contractor or whatever. And then, but on the bright side, given the level of government spending and taxation, borrowing was $100 billion less than it otherwise would have been in 2019 or something. Is that kind of what you're saying? Whereas now something else will have to give because that extra amount coming back is now not showing up.
Right. And looking at recent experience, we would assume that number one, the debt would go up. Number two, taxes would go up. It is inconceivable in this day and age that spending would go down. So that extra $100 billion will have to come out of one of those. And, one of the, I think it's good just to mention the private ownership. That gets a lot of attention, I think, online. The private ownership, I don't think it's not such a huge deal. It rankles for sure, right? Because the Fed is supposed to be this disinterested independent agency, but actually if it turns out it's, owned by the banks, that's pretty disgusting. But I think the vast majority of the damage that the Fed is doing is this printing up of the money supply. And it does that not necessarily because the banks per se tell it to every year. It's kind of designed to work that way, to be sort of a standing bailout, to encourage the financial system to grow as quickly as possible. And, as opposed to a free market system where growing as fast as possible would then lend to periodic panics. Once you sort of put those guardrails in and make it absolutely impossible to fail, then yes, the thing can go incredibly fast. They can drive 150 miles per hour all the time. And then we get the situation, we've seen over these past 15 years where, even a light drizzle turns into an existential crisis. I don't know if you remember, Bob, in 2008, comedian Jon Stewart, who was great at one time, he had a rant about the financial system. And he said, they keep saying, this is the perfect storm. This is the once in a century storm. But these things are happening every week. I'm starting to think this is not a perfect storm. This is a regular storm, and we have a shitty boat. And I think, when we talk about SVB, when we talk about Deutsche Bank or Credit Suisse or all these panics going on right now, when you dig into each one individually, they're not that big a deal. Silicon Valley Bank, they didn't have some catastrophic, like the guy siphoned off half the resources and went and bought an island like Sam Bankman-Fried. These are regular storms. Credit Suisse has been badly run for 20 years. Everybody's known this. It's just bank after bank that's running into these regular storms, and they keep magnifying into perfect storms. And so I think that Jon Stewart's point basically holds that we have an incredibly fragile financial system. It is fragile because the Fed sort of does that standing bailout guarantee through the money printer. And more than whether it's privately owned or something, I think that is really sort of the existential question really for our future, because every time that it collapses, we get a Leviathan, sort of a ratchet up, like a Bob Hicks style ratchet up in Leviathan.
Yeah, definitely. Right. I agree with you. That's why I say it's not, because they're not private companies. I guess the huge difference is like the Federal Open Market Committee, like most of those members are picked through the political process, and certainly the chair, has to be nominated and confirmed. That's all politically done. On the other hand, I just think if Pfizer literally owned 20% of the FDA, that would be weird. And and got paid, based on the FDA's profits every year or so. And if the FDA bought and sold pharmaceuticals and made money that way, and then gave some of the returns to Pfizer, that would be weird.
Which bears some resemblance to reality. In fact, and yes, it is absolutely super weird. And on that private ownership thing, I mean, it's very cute how they run it. So whenever it's convenient for the Fed, they're a public agency. They've got they got the Eagle and they got the whole thing. And then whenever it's useful for them in other contexts, now they say, no, we're private. You got to have freedom of commerce, and what are you, a communist? So, for example, FOIA requests, right? Freedom of Information Act requests, which are a very, very important, for us at Heritage, we use those to try to see what's going on the inside. And so if we are asking, for example, who is imposing a CBDC dystopia on our country, well, those meetings are occurring at the Fed. And we cannot file FOIAs against the Fed because in that context, it's private. So I think it's not just weird, it's evil the way that they play. They sort of coast this gray zone that only exists for the Federal Reserve. Right? What other agency in America is neither public nor private from a legal point of view?
Do you know how that works? So that's a great point. I didn't realize that. I never thought about it. Like if Elizabeth Warren is meeting with lobbyists, can you FOIA that or not?
Politicians, you can't. All government agencies, of course, you can. There are certain national security, which, of course, is a very expansive and flexible term. when it comes to the Fed, the board of governors you can, the regionals you cannot. And of course, they'll claim, this could influence markets, things like this. So the sort of Fed secrecy version of what the CIA does is to claim that, this is market-sensitive information. Ron Paul famously used to grill them, and he would just say, I want information on this. And inevitably, the Fed chair would say, no.
Right.
That's it.
My favorite.
At which point.
Yeah.
Right.
It wasn't with Ron Paul had left to this, but my favorite of that was December of 2008, right? So a few months after the financial crisis, this is when the Fed's doing all the extraordinary measures, and Bernanke's sitting before, some congressional committee, and they weren't second guessing him. They weren't saying you're not allowed to do these. They just said, okay, you're telling, you just testified that, you have this new window that's open, this new facility, blah, 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 that is getting toxic assets. And so far you've dispersed, I don't remember what the number was. It was, I think, hundreds of billions at that point in loans just in the last few months. Can you tell us who the recipients of those loans were? And of course, Bernanke said, well, no, that would defeat the purpose of the program. So no. So Congress not only had no authority to stop him from just creating hundreds of billions and handing it out to bankers, he didn't even have to tell them which bankers he was giving it to. It was great.
It's astounding. And, the idea that the economy is run by an independent agency to which we, the voters, have no direct control. I'm not sure that was the premise of the Constitution. The idea that we, the voters, are so stupid that you've just got to keep us out of the way and you've got to let our betters manage us. That does not sound like the sort of core bargain of the American Republic.
Yeah, and you mentioned Jon Stewart a minute ago. He had a good one. I think it was Alan Greenspan. He had Alan Greenspan as a guest at one point and asked him, you normally believe in free markets and blah, 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 but yet the Federal Reserve kind of just is this central agency that sets interest rates and stuff. Isn't that a contradiction? And Greenspan, gave some double talk or whatever, but I thought that's a pretty good, coming from John. Obviously Jon Stewart isn't a laissez-faire, Rothbardian, but he was saying your rhetoric, Greenspan, you claim to be, and yet.
Yeah, that is actually something that I think is topical and interesting. All right, is that there are a lot of Bernie bros, and I would more or less put Jon Stewart in that batch. There are, and this was the Occupy Wall Street people that showed up in right around the same time that the Tea Party did, right? And I was very excited back then. This is 2008, 2009. I was really excited because you had all these people on the left who were pissed off at, the way our financial system works, and they were pissed off at the Fed and they want to change. You had all these people on the right who felt the same way, and I thought, oh man, you guys should sit down and get together and maybe do something about this and change it. And then of course, the media came in and, no, you're racist, or I don't even know if they were still, peddling that back then, but whatever it was, they came in and sort of threw in the apple of discord and tried to break everybody up. And I still retain hope that, there are a lot of people on the left. I know among Bitcoiners, for example, a lot of, my followers they're very left wing. Mm-hmm. Usually they find me through Bitcoin, and Bitcoin appeals to, a wide variety. Most people who own Bitcoin are actually left wing. That's probably just a function of their age, right? Younger people tend to grok it better than older, and younger people also haven't had enough life experience to graduate from progressivism. But at any rate, I do still hold out hope that, left and right can get together on this, and the Bernie bros and the ANCAPs can unite as one and change this frickin' system. And I figure change the stuff that we agree is bad. We'll get all that fixed. That'll take, 3 months maximum. And then at that point, we can go back to fighting.
Yeah, right. It'd be better to be fighting with the hard money in place. Yeah.
That's right. How much better is combat with hard money?
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That is interesting. Let me circle back, Peter. Can we just think through, because we're both professional economists and we know what we're doing here. So I want to explore a little bit more deeply this issue of, should we care about Fed losses? So yes, what you said so far, I like that you're trying to isolate and say, look, it's not so much, oh no, that the Fed loaded up on $1 trillion of, X during COVID or whatever. I'm obviously just making up rounded numbers of treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, other agency debt. Okay. And then, oh no,
Right.
interest rates rose rapidly, so there was a big asset. And your point is that no, the real problem was that they just created $1 trillion through accounting gimmicks and loaded up. And so, that's the issue. I don't care as much about whether they turned a profit on that or not.
Right. So the metaphor that I like for that is imagine that you're a counterfeiter and you print up $1 million in the basement, and then you go onto, into the casino or onto FTX and you lose 90% of it gambling. So, is that a bad thing? Well, if you pretend that the original money was real, then you just lost $900,000. That's an absolute catastrophe. You should re-examine your life choices. On the other hand, if you recognize that it was just fake money that you printed up, then it really doesn't matter to you. Now, it matters to the broader economy because you just poured, $1 million of fake money into the economy. So you've now effectively stolen buying power from every other dollar in existence. Right. And so now if you stick with that counterfeiter, and what if he goes home and does it again and again and again and again? In none of those scenarios is he suffering losses, right? It's not like, sooner or later he'll have, I don't know, whatever, $300 million in paper losses, but it doesn't matter because none of it was real, right? The only real consequences of this is that you've got this absolute pipeline flowing into wherever he lives, Ballackinwood, Pennsylvania or something, that is, in this case, if he's gambling it, then of course it's diffusing across the entire economy. So it's flooding in, and then it is effectively robbing purchasing power as it gets distributed through the economy, of course, in Cantillon. So, in order to who receives it next.
Okay, so this is good. Let me push you because I was thinking about this. We're gonna go really deep here on the Human Action Podcast. Let me push back. I'm wondering if I think I might disagree with you on one little point there. Okay, so there's a counterfeiter. He prints up $1 million. We all agree like that right there is criminal. In any just society that would be criminal. And if you try to say, well, it's specific because clearly he's diluting the value. He hasn't made the mere act of him creating $1 million new dollars has not created more farmland or more vehicles or more food. So if he went out and just bought $1 million worth of consumption, clearly that means there's less stuff for everybody else. That it has to be.
Right.
Some might benefit if they anticipate, and some might, but in general, on average, everybody else, there has to be a sense in which they're $1 million poor collectively to counteract, to correspond to his $1 million gain. But now I want to say, suppose we've got two different possibilities. In one case, he takes the $1 million and he buys a bunch of raw materials and hires workers and whatever to build a building. And then, but he does a terrible job designing this, and it just collapses. No one dies. Like it collapses when no one's in it. In another scenario, it's actually a perfectly functional apartment building, and then he rents it out. And so with his $1 million, he parlayed that into future profits. Isn't there a sense in which, the fact that he made the million's bad, but if he then lost money by investing it poorly, that would also squander resources over and above the original problem, or not? Am I double counting? Do you get what I'm saying? Do you don't we care what he does with that $1 million?
Well, I think your example is excellent. It's very clear because you're tracing it from the original inflation all the way to the ultimate consequences of it. So in the case, like if he loses at the casino or something, then it goes to somebody else, and then the question is, what do those individuals do with it? Do they go, do they waste it on stuff? Do they go eat food that, I don't know, they buy so much expensive sushi that they throw up? Whatever they do with it, then we can sort of trace through and see whether, there was sort of a gain, a net utility gain for society. But your example, right, where, he goes out, he builds an apartment building that then falls down, right? So that sort of, compresses the whole process into one single question. And right, in that case, if he went out and built a building that was useful, then we would say, well, he stole it, but he didn't necessarily destroy resources, setting aside the imperfect incentives. But indeed, right, if he went out and built a building and then it collapsed, then it would mean that those resources were seized from society, and they were not just stolen, where they're still in existence, but they were actually then destroyed.
Okay, so it's maybe that's a good way of putting it. That rather. Him printing up money and then going and voluntarily bidding away the resources from others, you're saying that's morally and in some sense economically equivalent to, well, no, it's not here. If he just went around with a gun and grabbed all those resources, then you could say, okay, given that he stole all that stuff and pointed the gun at various, workers and carpenters and said, hey, go build that.
Right.
Other things equal, yeah, I guess I'd rather him do a good job and make a building that's useful, given that, rather than the other thing. And I guess the difference, though, is I was going to say it's economically, but no, because if he's pointing the gun, then it's clear who the losers are. It's the people directly from whom he's stolen the stuff, or the carpenter who's now being forced to work at gunpoint. Whereas if he prints the money, the losses kind of get distributed among all users of that currency, or all holders of assets denominated in that currency.
And your point is very important because we can bring that home to the specific money that we're talking about here, right? So, over the past, 3 years since COVID hit, the Fed, I think they're up, $5 trillion on their balance sheet so far. So, and we can pretty much see where that money went, because it subsidized borrowing, right? And so the borrowing during the entire COVID episode was near zero. Rates were extraordinarily low. The Fed rate was near zero. And so what did that lead to? Well, it led to, enormous government deficits. And then, we had multi-trillion-dollar deficits over those years. And where did that money go? Well, I would argue largely it went to financing COVID lockdowns. So in other words, the money they created that is now showing up as a loss, right, that was not spent on a nice apartment building. That was spent on COVID lockdowns, or it was spent on whatever else the government has been spending over the last 3 years, which much of it has been fairly wasteful. So I'd argue that in this particular case, pretty much in all cases, the government or the money that the Fed is creating that way because it is subsidizing borrowing, and borrowing is overwhelmingly, the government, large corporations, rich people. It ends up being squandered. So it's not just that it's being redistributed, it's being stolen from everybody else's dollars, but it's actually being squandered because it goes into subsidizing borrowing so that it's at below market rates.
Okay, good. Yeah. Yeah. What you just said right there, you had a slightly different train of argument, but I think we ended up at the same spot because here's what I was going to want to run this by you.
Yeah.
I was thinking, okay, like if Walmart comes out and announces $1 billion loss, should we care? Obviously, if you are a part owner of Walmart, you care. If you work there, your pensions with them, or I don't know if they have I don't know how that works, but I'm told they don't even pay people enough to live, so I don't know how their employees are still alive. But so I doubt they give them pensions, right? But clearly, or supplier, like if you're a supplier and your main customers, what you care. But just the regular person who doesn't use Walmart, whatever, doesn't shop there, do they care? And I was thinking, well. And certainly in the Misesian tradition, like what does it mean when you earn an entrepreneurial profit? It's that there was a sense in which you anticipated future market conditions better than others. That's why, there were resources that were relatively underpriced. And so you grabbed them, transformed them into something, goods and services that the consumers bid more for. And, the fact that you earned a profit means in some sense, you saw the future better than your rivals did. And so at least ex post, looking back, like, to announce I earned a big profit as a company means I was a good steward of society's resources, at least insofar as the consumers are judges of what's good for them. And so then the flip side, if a big company announces a huge losses, there's a sense in which that's bad because, you squandered some resources and it wasn't purely falling on your shareholders. Just like if somebody invents a cure for cancer, that guy's probably going to be rich, but it still helps other people too. It's not just that he captures all the, so that sort of thing. And then I was thinking, okay, so for financial speculators, if JP Morgan or some investment bank announces big losses, I guess it's showing that, they actually screwed up the prices of assets because they bid improperly. So then, and here's where my conclusion, I think, dovetail with you were saying. Yeah. So if we say, what's the harm in the fact that the Fed bought $1 trillion worth of assets and then lost money, it's because it must have overpaid for them. And so it artificially pushed down interest rates through its actions, which would screw everybody up, given that interest rates are coordinating things. So among other implications, if the Fed's coming out and saying, we just lost a bunch of money on our assets, there's a sense in which, well, then you misled everybody through your actions. And the bigger the loss, the more harm you caused or the more you push financial markets out of equilibrium, I guess, if that's the way you want to. How do you feel about that kind of?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, we'll be able to quantify those, or at least estimate them at the next recession. Well, here, let's just imagine that we live in a freer market. If we lived in a free world, in a free market world, then, of course, we'd be able to estimate all those interventions in the next recession, because we could see how much of those malinvestments are liquidated, and then we could, sort of tally up how much damage all of that Fed manipulation did. Of course, we don't live in that world, right? In this world, they're going to do a Japan-style zombie continuation to try to string it along with ZERP, and we're never actually going to see what all the malinvestment is. They're just going to try to carry it on. But I'll give you a metaphor of the cure for cancer, right? So in a sense, if Walmart is losing money, if I'm not a shareholder, you might say, and let's say I'm not a customer either, then you might say, why do you care? Well, I care for the same reason that, like, if I don't have cancer and I read in the newspaper that they cured cancer, and then the next day I read that, it turns out the cure doesn't work, I'm very sad. Something very valuable that I thought was created, it turns out is not there. And so similarly, a Walmart that is making profit indicates to you that it is an amazing thing. It is this machine that creates happiness and, children all across the land. It's like Santa Claus, right? Children can have high quality, low priced consumer items. And then if it turns out that, they're actually making a loss, then what this tells me is that the machine is broken. It's not working. And, we might hope that Walmart management figures out what the problem is. Maybe it was just a one-off mistake they made. Maybe, the people need to be switched or whatever. But it's an indication that at least that machine is sick. And of course, the economy is made up, in a sense, it's made up of a whole bunch of machines, whether they're corporations, whether they're individuals, trying for some goal in life. And, just like I'd be very sad if an individual said, I decided to finally go running every day and I did it for 300 days, but yesterday I slept in. Okay, yeah, I'd be kind of sad for them, even though I'm not the residual claimant, I'm not the one who's benefiting from the exercise, but I love the fact that value is being created, and especially when it's on the scale of Walmart, which is, I don't know, a $300 billion company or something. I would certainly hope that machine is not breaking.
Yeah, yes, definitely. Okay. Well, that's probably as good a spot as any to wrap up. So my guest this week, folks, has been Peter St. Onge. Peter, thanks for your time.
Thanks for having me on, Bob.
And we will be back next week with Jeff back in his seat to bring you the latest news and chicanery from the Fed and other places. Thanks for listening.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.